fidelium et tui amoris sine singim accende, imite spiritum tuum et creabuntur. Oremus, Deus, qui corda fidelium, Sancti Spiritus illos ratione locuisti, de nobis in eodem spiritu recta sapere, et de eius semper consolatione godere, per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sit sapientiae,
Ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, so continue. You mentioned we were going over last time some things concerning the transfer of the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, which was brought about by the emperor whose name the city bears, Constantine. The preceding year, 300 to the transfer of the capital, the year 326 had been marked by the death of one of the most devoted champions of the faith. This is Saint Alexander, Patriarch of Alexandria, who, upon his death, left the patriarchal throne to Saint Athanasius, who also inherited to the full the zeal, the virtue, the energy, and the activity of his holy predecessor. Nor was it long before these qualities were all called into action. So even as a deacon, in fact, Saint Athanasius had as an assistant to Saint Alexander, the Patriarch of Alexandria. You may recall from last year, anyone who was here, the fact that Saint Athanasius was already in that capacity involved in the first really highlighting the fact that that Arius was in fact a heretic. And that he was a troublemaker in that way, as heretics always are, being rebels. Heretics are troublemakers. And Saint Athanasius was instrumental in bringing about the first condemnations of Arius' heretical doctrines. And for that reason, Arius saw him as an enemy from early on, even long before before Arius had been condemned at the Council of Nicaea. His heresy continued to grow in popularity. He was ultimately condemned to the Council of Nicaea. All of his doctrines, his heresies were condemned there. But even before that, he already saw Saint Athanasius as an enemy. So the empress, or the princess Constantia, sister to Constantine, had always entertained a secret attachment for Eusebius of Nicaea and the doctrine which he professed. So Eusebius of Nicaea is one of the, after Arius himself, one of the most problematic Arians. So and we do have to specify Eusebius of Nicaea because there were other Eusebiuses around, not all of whom were so problematic. But you see mention of Eusebius of Nicaea, usually Eusebius without any further qualification, or of the Eusebians, those who followed Eusebius of Nicaea. It's just bad news, just almost always entirely bad news. So on her deathbed, she recommended to Constantine's favor an Arian priest, in whom she placed the greatest confidence, who succeeded. This Arian succeeded in persuading the emperor that the Council of Nicaea had condemned the heresiarch, that is Arius, without knowing his real sentiments. And this is an interesting thing to note, because the church is actually protected by infallibility in not only condemning errors, but actually identifying where those errors are contained. These are known as dogmatic facts. That is, these are certain truths which are not contained in divine revelation, but which are very closely connected to the preservation or the protecting of divine revelation, which has been committed to the care of the church. There are certain facts which are still protected, which the church has the charism of infallibility extends to the church's ability to ascertain those facts. So, and the classic example of this is something that kind of came along many centuries later, but with regard to Jansenism. that the church condemned. For one thing, the Jansenius himself, for whom Jansenism is named, seems not to have been any kind of pertinacious heretic himself. His work only became famous and then controversial after he died. And he protested that he was a faithful son of the church. If there's anything wrong with what I've said, he said things to this effect: if there's anything wrong with what I've said, I retracted. I don't want to, essentially I don't want to be a heretic. But his work became only prominent after he died. And once it became prominent and therefore evident that there were errors in it, the church condemned those errors, and the Jansenists, his followers, all said, oh yes, absolutely, the church is correct in condemning those errors, but those errors are not what we hold, they said. Those errors are not actually in this book. And that is where they're themselves not only wrong, but in fact defying something that the church has infallible ability to determine, and that is not only what doctrines are erroneous, but where those erroneous doctrines are actually contained. So this is those are called dogmatic facts. There are other things that are that qualify as dogmatic facts, but that is the first example that comes to mind, is that the church has the ability to determine where in fact erroneous doctrines are in fact to be found. And in this case, that this was, whether Arius wrote anything or not, certainly that this is something that originated from him, from Arius. And so, indeed, the church is protected by infallibility in defining and determining such things. The church, in fact, did indeed, therefore, correctly determine that the things that Arius was saying before actually condemning condemning his errors. But this Arian priest convinced the emperor Constantine, who, remember, had been very instrumental in calling the Council of Nicaea, very much so. He was very actively involved. Now, at every stage, he was actively involved, which was seen at the time as perfectly normal. And that might seem strange in a world where separation of church and state is practically seen as a dogma. But in fact, in a normal situation, not to say that the situation in the Roman Empire was perfect, it was improving, definitely. It wasn't perfect yet. They said that's not to say that things are ever 100% perfect everywhere, but things were moving in the right direction. Remember, persecution had been officially ended. Things were moving in the right direction. The emperor was protecting the church, even if the faith had not yet been made the religion of state, and paganism positively outlawed. That came later. But things were moving in the right direction already, even just to that extent. At this particular stage at which we are looking right now, the emperor is already very actively involved in assisting the church in every way. We saw that how much he endowed the church with material goods, building churches, for example, and endowing those churches with rich gifts. Also, he was very much involved in helping the council to assemble. This fact gives rise oftentimes to the accusation that, the Emperor Constantine. There are different dates at which enemies, various heretics in the history of the church, have started accusing the church or the real church as they see it of disappearing or something going wrong. And one of those instances is actually the calling of the Council of Nicaea. They say, well, I was actually called by the Emperor Constantine. And there's some plausibility to that. It's in fact false, but the reason why that seems to have some credibility is because he was actively involved in assembling its members. But it's one thing to spread the word and to get people to come to a particular place, and actually to call a council with authority. Only the Pope can call a general council of the church with authority. And that Council of Nicaea was the first ecumenical council. Ecumenical in a Catholic sense, meaning extending to the entire church, to the church as it is spread throughout the entire world. Ecumenism, in the sense of Vatican II, that's something false. An ecumenical council means embracing the entire Catholic world, an ecumenical council of the Catholic Church. It comes from a Greek word meaning the entire world, meaning specifically the entire Catholic world. So he was indeed involved in that, the Emperor Constantine, but he had no authority to convoke a council. It was all done with the consent of the Pope. And he was only because the Pope approved of it that it counted as anything at all. We've talked about that before a bit, the fact that It's how the Pope is everything, in a sense, in the Catholic Church. The Vicar of Christ on earth has the plenitude of jurisdiction in the Church, the only one able to call a general council. So the Emperor Constantine was actively involved, which is actually a very good thing, but it was not due to his authority that it was able to have any kind of effect at all. It was the authority of the Church, the Pope. It was by the authority of the Pope that the Council of Nicaea was in fact constituted as a council. So this notion that the Council of Nicaea had condemned Arius without knowing what it was he actually said, complete nonsense, for reasons we've explained. Constantine recalled Arius anyway. He bought that lie, who showed him a profession of faith couched in vague and ambiguous terms, in which the word consubstantial was omitted, and that of course is key. We'll see that there are various saints who have rejected even professions of faith which could be taken correctly, not because of not because of any sin of commission, not because of expressing any error or heresy, but because they do not express the truth with adequate clarity. So it's possible in that sense for a profession of faith to sin by omission. Because remember, there are two, for our purposes right now, there is an obligation not only of actually holding the faith, but of professing it as well. It's possible to sin, and even to sin gravely, while still holding the faith through inadequately professing it. There are many different ways in which that might be the case. For example, there's one example today, unfortunately, and has been the case for a long time. One way of sinning against the obligation to profess the faith is, for example, to sometimes on various forms that you might have to fill out, they ask you what your religion is, to check off the box that says Christian instead of Catholic is actually a way of sinning against the obligation to profess the faith. Because objectively, it's true. Of course, Christian means Catholic. Those terms are in fact synonymous. It's an absurdity to try to make a distinction between the two, as various heretics have tried to do. But heretics have hijacked the term Christian, we can put it that way, to such an extent that someone says without any further qualification, I'm a Christian, the obvious conclusion is that person's actually a heretic, some member of some Protestant sect, or some various different sects that might claim the name Christian. But if you don't say I'm a Catholic, then you'll be taken to, but instead of Christian, anybody who uses that term yet without explaining what he means by that, in fact, is taken to be something other than a member of the Catholic Church, and therefore something other than a Christian understood correctly. So that is an example. It's true, obviously, to say, as a member of the Catholic Church, I am a Christian, obviously. In fact, we're obliged to, if ever challenged, are you a Christian? Say, yes, a member of the Catholic Church. We always have to be clear about what we mean by that, of course. But it's possible to, in other words, by saying something that is objectively true, in itself true, but to do it in a way that is in some way defective, it's possible to sin, and even sin gravely, against the obligation to profess the faith. So we'll see that there are sometimes not only in a way as simple as that, but more complicated ways in signing professions of faith that use technical theological language. It's possible to sin by omission, or in a sense, it's possible that the profession itself sin by omission, by way of insufficiently expressing a truth that is, perhaps under those circumstances, vitally important to express with the utmost clarity. So it was stated that the word was produced or created by the Father before all ages. So vague and ambiguous in some places, but of course that's just outright heresy to say that the Word of God is created as a creature. That's false. That's heresy in the fullest sense of the term. Because you'll see that if you haven't already seen that in any course, you'll see it eventually. That heresy is, in a technical sense, is even so there are distinctions to be made among doctrines that merit technically the censure of heresy, but that is at the very highest level of theological censure, heresy. There are other doctrines, or other erroneous doctrines, other kinds of errors that don't merit the technical censure of heresy, but which are still so seriously erroneous that they might in a broad sense be called heresy. This right here, of course, is heresy, strictly speaking. So the emperor was satisfied, and he was, Constantine seems not to have been exactly a theologian, we'll say. He was satisfied with this insidious declaration that the exile of Arius was at an end, unfortunately. This is after the emperor had been involved in convoking the Council of Nicaea. In a broad sense, he had been instrumental in bringing it together. Even after all that, he brings back Arius. This and again, our author here, who likes, you have to understand the authors as you read them. You have to understand who it is who wrote what it is you're reading. This author likes to whitewash anybody whom he likes. So even in this case, he has to admit that this is a lamentable inconsistency, which is to put it as nicely as possible. Renewed all the discussions which had been settled by the Council of Nicaea, and opened the way to endless disputes. So yes, Constantine, he did a great deal at the service of the church on the one hand. On the other, he's making some very bad decisions by buying this lie, for one thing, and then bringing back Arius as a result of it, as a result of being really so gullible as that. After recalling Arius, the emperor could hardly refuse the same favor to Eusebius of Nicaea and Theognis of Nice, who returned in the year 328 to their churches and expelled those who had been consecrated in their stead. So this is becoming seriously problematic. The spirit of cabal necessarily came in with them. Eusebius of Nicaea was particularly incensed by the firmness with which St. Eustatius, Patriarch of Antioch, constantly battled against the Arian heresy in his profound and eloquent writings. A heretic called a conventicle of Arian bishops at Antioch and deposed, supposedly, St. Eustatius. So, a conventicle, a small meeting of Arian bishops, and they decided to oust the Patriarch of Antioch. Of course, they can't actually do that. Ultimately, there has been debate. There's some debate among Catholic theologians even how exactly authority comes from Christ to the bishop of any diocese. Certainly, all agree that in practice the Pope has to appoint him, and it seems that, especially since certain teachings of Pope Pius XII, that the authority of the bishops do indeed come through the Pope. Whatever the case, a bishop of a diocese is whomever the Pope installs. And this is true even in the case of certain situations in the history of the Church where the civil power has the ability to nominate, or in some cases to veto, certain candidates for different positions in the hierarchy of the Church. Again, and it sounds like a strange thing perhaps to us today, certainly in the United States, that the state would want to have any say in what the Church does. That might come across as strange, but of course that fact just illustrates how disordered really is the situation in this country, as it is in many places. But under normal circumstances, the state will be interested in that, but will not interfere. There are cases in the history of the Church in which there has been certain union of church and state, either correctly ordered or incorrectly disordered to some degree, but problematic to the extent that the state wants to interfere in the naming of bishops. And any kind of veto ability or nomination ability that the state has, that's purely by concession of the Church. And the authority of the Church, the Pope says, will agree to abide by your list of nominations. We'll appoint somebody on a list of nominees, or if you veto somebody, okay, we will not appoint him. Ultimately, the state has zero power over such things. Any kind of vetoes or nominations that the state makes are purely by way of concession on the part of the Church. At any second, the Pope could say, we're not doing that anymore, forget that. But such things are always granted to a state typically because that state is giving some trouble to the Church. And the only possible way that that particular Pope who made that concession could see of gaining any kind of peace for the Church and of allowing the Church to function as normally as possible is to grant such concessions. And those have come with very bad consequences in many cases. And at a certain point, actually, St. Pius X just completely we're not no more concordat with France because of we're not going to abide by any such agreement because the French government will not know anybody acceptable. So he just said, forget all of that. He consecrated bishops himself and sent them into France. And of course, that the French government was not happy about that, but the French Third Republic was just thoroughly horrible from practically the day it was founded, so it's not really surprising. And in fact, if anything, that just shows that St. Pius X had the right idea of how to deal with things. And that's for many centuries later. The French government had already itself been very problematic, very troublesome with regard to concordats with the church. A concordat being an agreement between the church and any given government. And there have been many concordats throughout the history of the church, but all that is for a much later time period. So, in other words, these Arian bishops have no authority to depose anybody. They're essentially just kicking him out, removing him physically. He's still the bishop, he's still the patriarch, because the Pope decided that he is. This condemnation was based on an infamous calumny, not that they had any authority to do this anyway, but this is what they're trying to do. Eusebius of Nicaea brought the testimony of an abandoned creature who appeared before the bishops and accused the Holy Patriarch of an abominable crime. The wretch, this woman, held a child in her arms, which she declared to be the fruit of her connection with Eustatius, which she confirmed with an oath. The victim of Eusebius's wickedness, when brought to her deathbed, so this woman died sometime later, declared to the assembled bishops that Eusebius of Nicaea had hired her to play this infamous part, but that her oath was not altogether false, since the child was the son of a coppersmith with whom she had lived in the state of concubinage, and who bore the same name as the Holy Patriarch Eustatius. So it was just a calumny against the Patriarch of Antioch. So you see the kind of character this Eusebius of Nicaea is. He's just you have to descend. You have to, in order to really to give him the titles he deserves, we'd have to. Well, we won't say those things. He was just absolutely horrible. Eusebius of Nicaea, clearly, and this is not the only time he's going to do something like this, or Arians, these heretics, will do something like this. Such was the evidence on which Eustatius was deposed, and Constantine had the weakness to send him into exile. Paulinus of Tyre, an Arian, was appointed to succeed him, but he died soon after and was followed in quick succession by a few others in the usurped see. So none of these claimants are legitimate, because the Pope does not allow for any of this. The Catholics, meanwhile, held their meetings apart and refused to communicate with the hirelings who were sent to them under the false title of pastors. And they were false mainly because the Pope decided that the real patriarch is the one who's been put into exile. So the Arians were yet to meet the strongest opposition from the See of Alexandria. So Arius made an attempt to re-enter the city. St. Athanasius openly rejected all his advances. Eusebius of Nicaea wrote to the Holy Patriarch, laying stress on his credit with Constantine and threatening him with the imperial indignation if he refused to receive Arius. Athanasius replied that no threats or human considerations could ever lead him to go against the decisions of the Council of Nicaea. The Eusebians despaired of overcoming St. Athanasius, and they joined the Meletians, other heretics, in accusing Athanasius of fomenting divisions throughout Africa by his unjust refusal of communion. So one reason we're looking at this particular time period in some detail is because it's a surprisingly common, attempt to justify, recognize, and resist the position, mainly of SSPX, but others as well. It's a surprisingly common attempt to try to justify that position by saying, in the time of the Arian crisis, St. Athanasius was practically the only Catholic bishop left in the entire world. Remember, St. Jerome said the world groaned and was surprised to find itself Arian. And so really recognize and resist, that's really not such an unusual thing, that there would be a very small number of people left. The clear parallel trying to be made is that Archbishop Lefebvre was another St. Athanasius, in other words, practically the only bishop doing anything. And that's just not true. Looking at the details of the situation, there is just no parallel between the current situation and this one, or whatever there is to only a very, very limited degree. only along very broad lines can there be any parallels made, and certainly there is no justification for schism to be found in the way that the Arian crisis played out, which recognize and resist the position of SSPX, and there are others as well who meet the description. That's objectively schism. Objectively, SSPX is schismatic objectively, no matter how you present the situation. If they're right in saying that the Novus Ordo hierarchy is the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, but they're wrong in that. But if they're right, then they're in schism because they do not submit to it as they ought to. They definitely do not obey them as Catholics obey the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. On the other hand, if they're wrong, which they are, in fact, in saying that that's the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, then they're also objectively schismatic because they profess communion with them. Most of all, of course, proclaiming the Novus Ordo supposed Pope to be Pope in the canon of the Mass itself. So they are schismatic objectively. There's no doubt there are many people among them who are in good faith, but objectively their system is schismatic whether they are right or wrong. They are wrong, so they're schismatic in that sense, in the sense of recognizing as professing unity with a false, professing to recognize a false hierarchy. They're schismatic in that particular way. But objectively, their system is schismatic, and sometimes they point to the very time period we're looking at right now to try to justify their position. And there is no parallel. And that's so we're going to look at this in some detail to illustrate just what the situation was then, and you can see as clearly as possible that it is not the situation that we have now. And now the situation is one in which you have supposedly the entire hierarchy of the Catholic Church teaching a false religion to the Catholic Church and leading souls to hell thereby. And supposedly this comes from the Pope himself and supposedly came from an ecumenical, a general council of the Catholic Church, promulgated to the entire world that binds all Catholics. That much is clear. That the intention, there are those who tried to say, oh, it was just a pastoral council, or there were no definitions made. Whatever the case, no, none of those are objections that can be answered another time. Clearly, it was meant to bind all Catholics. Paul VI was absolutely clear about that. Whatever else he may have been unclear about, he was most definitely clear that, no, everybody has to submit to this. Absolutely, no question. And that's true. That is abundantly clear to this day, the way that people in the Novus Ordo are treated when they start to point out problems with Vatican II. Clearly, they are meant to obey it, submit to it without question. So that is the situation today. Looking at the 4th century, which we're doing right now, the situation was one of people professing a heresy that had been, in fact, far from being supposedly approved by the Pope, had been, in fact, explicitly condemned by the Pope, by an ecumenical council of the Catholic Church, and which was still being held on to by certain troublemakers who were persecuting faithful Catholics, even bishops, patriarchs, prominent members of the hierarchy of the Church. These heretics are still persecuting the Catholics, faithful Catholics, in some places. You notice we're not even talking about Western Europe here. We're not talking about what's happening in the Catholic Church in Spain or in Gaul or any place else. The Roman provinces, Hispania or Gallia, which are, of course, Spain, the nations of Spain and France. We're not talking about any of that because this wasn't much of a problem, if at all, in those places. So it was not, neither was the entire world, even just the way that the Novus Ordo religion is spread everywhere. Arianism was simply not spread everywhere. It was just not as extensive. So there, on so many levels, there is no analogy. Most importantly, the key aspect is that it does not come from Rome. Arianism never came from Rome, supposedly. Just as the Novus Ordo religion supposedly comes from the Pope, has now supposedly been taught by multiple popes in the minds of those who are in the Novus Ordo. So that is the key difference. There are many others, and we're looking at the details of it just to see just how extensively these are two completely separate situations, and that whatever parallels there are very, very limited. About the extent of it is that there was widespread heresy, and Catholics had a hard time. That's about it. You can make certain parallels between persecution such as it is today and persecution at the time, but even then, the persecution comes in different ways. There are more ways of persecuting somebody than by challenging him either to give up the faith or undergo death. So that's why we're going to look at this in some detail, just to drive home that point as far as possible. So, false accusations being leveled by heretics against St. Athanasius. The emperor wrote to St. Athanasius in language which, that's true, it is painful to quote from the pen of Constantine. For this author, particularly painful because there's no way he can whitewash this, because he would if he could. We can say that of this author. He tries to whitewash Napoleon, and when he treats of that section of church history, he wants to present Napoleon as being somebody who was really great. Napoleon was a military genius, no question of that, but in so many other ways he was the ultimate rat. Certainly no good Catholic. Public sinner. He abandoned his wife at some point and tried to marry somebody else. So, for example, definitely gave the church a tremendous amount of trouble. But this author likes him, so he tries to whitewash him as much as possible. So, it is definitely unfortunate, in a sense painful to read from the pen of Constantine, knowing this author, though it's probably particularly painful for him. He can't whitewash this. Knowing my will on the subject, he said, give free entrance to all who wish to come into the church. For if I hear of your refusing admittance to anyone, I shall give immediate orders to have you deposed and sent into exile. So, there is no way to take that well. He has no authority to do that. He's telling him, let the heretics in or I'm going to kick you out. He doesn't have any authority to kick at anybody in a juridical sense, no authority to deprive St. Athanasius of his ecclesiastical jurisdiction. But he's going to try his utmost, if he doesn't allow the heretics back in, he's going to do the utmost to get him removed physically. St. Athanasius answered with modest firmness that it was impossible for him to obey, that a heresy impugning the divinity of Jesus Christ could have nothing in common with the Catholic Church. So also the insistence on refusing to have anything to do as far as possible with heretics is something that might also come across as extremely harsh or as unnecessarily strong in a world such as ours today, in which liberalism in so many forms is so widespread that most of all you can think whatever you want. Whereas in fact, heresy as a sin, heresy has various aspects, heresy as a sin in the moral order, as an offense against God, is extremely serious. So it involves a far greater degree of malice than, for example, sins of impurity. So that to violate the 6th and 9th commandments in the most horrifying ways, those are still lesser sins than it is a sin to defy God by denying truths contained in his revelation. That is a greater sin still. It's a sin that is much more intellectual and therefore far more malicious than sins that involve weakness. It involves less weakness and more malice. Much less weakness, much more malice. Now, certainly weakness can still be involved, and every sin involves malice. Certainly there is a great deal, very grave malice involved in committing sins of impurity, but the proportion of malice to weakness is there's much more malice compared to weakness in sins of a more intellectual nature. In other words, by sinning through sins such as heresy, a man sins much more in the manner of a demon, of the devil himself. Whereas sinning against the 6th and 9th commandments, sinning against the virtue of chastity, that makes man to be like a beast, like an animal, and which is very shameful, but it's less grave than it is to sin in a manner similar to that in which the devil himself sinned. Which, again, the sin of the devil is a purely intellectual sin, pure malice, sin of pure malice. The devil saw the full consequences of what his sin of his sin, should he choose to sin, and he and of course all the other demons still chose that. That's something you study about in your dogmatic theology courses, how all of that works. That the angels were given one chance. They had the sin of the devil and of the other demons is they cannot be redeemed from that. they saw the full consequences of what they would of sinning, and they still chose to sin. So it's a different case from that of human beings, in other words. So this right here, you can see clearly at the time it was very well understood, certainly by faithful Catholics, just the extreme malice of heresy, and how extremely important it is to preserve oneself from any danger of ever falling into heresy, and that means keeping the heretics physically far away as possible. So the Eusebians, the followers of Eusebius of Nicaea, now resorted to a calumny, which they thought must produce an irresistible effect upon the emperor's mind. So this is also typical. Here we're seeing established patterns that heretics throughout time have followed. For one thing, yes, resorting to all kinds of devious means to try to set up those who oppose them as being evil, whereas they themselves are the villains, and also seeking the protection of the state. The protection of the state by giving the civil rulers what they want, telling them what they want to hear, or telling them they're allowed to do various things they want to do that are gravely sinful or seriously harmful to the church in some way. Not that they could ever destroy the church, but that still cause the church serious trouble in various ways. Telling them that they can do those things, that it's right, that they're giving their blessing, quote unquote, to various things. Or by currying favor somehow through a variety of methods, effectively in exchange for protection from being disciplined by the church, or perhaps by some even higher civil power. Classic example is Martin Luther, who managed to survive because he buttered up the various German nobles, various German princes, who were the ones who really held the power in the Holy Roman Empire. Germany, for a long time, it was not really until the 19th century that Germany was a centralized, unified nation. The forging of the German Empire in the late 19th century under Prussian leadership was when Germany really emerged as a centralized nation state. Before that, it was very decentralized, very much so. So much so that that's what ensured for a long time, when you study it, why there was never any major conflict between France and Germany. Whereas really the First World War, in many ways the most destructive conflict in history, at its nucleus was a rivalry between France or France's desire for revenge upon Germany for a defeat in a previous war. That was at the nucleus of it, and everything else built up around that, and caused a dual alliance system to come into being, which ultimately caused the war to break out. And that scenario was not possible before the 19th century because Germany was very decentralized. So in the time of Martin Luther in the 16th century, that decentralized situation was still very much in place, and had been for centuries, would be for centuries more. And so the Holy Roman Emperor, theoretically the ruler of that empire, which was comprised very greatly of German states, couldn't really do much. At the time, the Emperor Charles V was also King Charles of the First of Spain. He was very powerful as King of Spain, but as Holy Roman Emperor, he couldn't do too much to force those who were theoretically his subjects in the hierarchy of the empire to do what he wanted. So he would have disciplined Martin Luther for sure if he'd been able to. He would have had him try. Certainly, the church excommunicated him. He would have tried and executed Luther as a pertinacious heretic and therefore guilty of treason if he'd been able to. But he wasn't able to because he had these German princes whose protection he effectively bought by currying their favor in different ways. So he told, very famously, the Landgrave Philip of Hesse that he could have two wives at the same time, for example. And that was one of his major protectors. So that's how he got that. That's how he was able to survive as long as he did, Martin Luther. And so he was never executed. Martin Luther died on a deathbed rather than by any kind of method of execution. So he died a horrible death in the sense that he died blaspheming the papacy till he died, but he was never executed. He was never disciplined to that extent. So that's a pattern you see throughout history, that heretics have to get protection from those who would discipline them. And in this case, the heretics, they have the ear of the emperor. The Arians have the ear of the Emperor Constantine himself, who, despite all the good he's done for the church, is also ultimately sees his job as being emperor and therefore of maintaining peace in the empire. So let's just sort all this out. He wants his empire to be peaceful, does not want it to be racked by religious divisions, which in itself, of course, is extremely problematic. But he's going about and healing those divisions in the wrong way. The way to deal with this is to discipline these heretics. If they will not repent of their heresy, to discipline them. Even yet, putting heretics to death for treason is not in itself something excessive. Now, that might come across as extremely shocking, so you say that most people today would be extremely shocked by it. In itself, that is not excessive. It is, heretics are rebels. And especially the monarchs of the Catholic nations of Western Europe in the Middle Ages understood with abundant clarity that heretics are rebels, and that rebels never stop rebelling, especially not rebels who are possessed of such a malicious type of rebellion as to defy divine revelation and the authority of God as the author of the supernatural invested in the Catholic Church. They understood very clearly that heretics will also proceed to rebellion against the state. Yes, sometimes they might, on the one hand, they have to butter up the civil power in some cases in order to get protection, but protection from what? In many cases, some still higher power, in the case of Martin Luther, the emperor, whom they are actually defying still through, or have been led to defy through their heresy. They're starting in heresy, they have been ultimately led to defy the authority of the state as well. And there have been wars fought. For example, the Albigensians in southern France, there was a crusade waged against them by the French kingdom, by kings of France who were still Catholic at the time, of course. So the Eusebians are the followers, Eusebius of Nicaea and his cronies, are resorting to a calumny which they thought must produce an irresistible effect on the emperor's mind. They brought a juridical accusation against the patriarch, this is St. Athanasius, of having entered into a conspiracy against the life of Constantine, and of having sent a chest of gold to Philomenos, the chief of the conspirators. Athanasius presented himself before Constantine, whom he easily convinced of his innocence, and returned loaded with gifts and praises of the inconstant emperor. So it's true, Constantine is proving to be someone who is fairly easy to turn in these things, which is unfortunate. The noise of strife excited in Alexandria by the Arians had reached the ears of St. Anthony in his desert solitude. So this is St. Anthony of the desert, one of the desert fathers. So he was personally acquainted. He and St. Athanasius were personally acquainted. In fact, they wrote each other's biographies. Very good reading, of course. This and the persecution directed against his disciple and friend, St. Athanasius. So St. Anthony heard of this persecution against St. Athanasius, and he drew down, these events drew him, St. Athanasius, or St. Anthony rather, down from his mountain cave to protest against the impiety of the heretics by the authority of his presence, his words, and his miracles. His path was thronged by the faithful. Some of his disciples wished to disperse the crowd in order to free him from their importunity, but he said, "Let them alone. They are not more numerous than the demons we fight on the mountain." So it's true, the Desert Fathers had to, they went into the desert precisely to isolate themselves from the influences of the world, but the devil can still provide temptations. Not only is human nature still fallen, but the devil can and in fact does inflict temptations. And not that he can never touch the will, but the devil can hold up very strong temptations. And so the Desert Fathers definitely had to deal with such temptations. So St. Anthony taught the multitude that stood about him that the word of God is not a creature, and that he is eternal and consubstantial with the Father. So teaching divine revelation, the truths defined by the Church concerning the Holy Trinity, God the Father and God the Son specifically here. So do not communicate with the Arians, he continued. You are Christians, but they say that the Son of God is a creature. They do not therefore differ from pagans, since they adore a creature instead of the Creator. Very good point. Having fulfilled the mission to which he had been urged by his zeal for the glory of God, St. Anthony returned to his solitude, followed by the admiration of all whom he had edified by the example of his virtue. But the Arians had not exhausted their charges against St. Athanasius. Those which they now brought against him surpass all that we are prepared to look for, even from men who have taken leave of the last vestige of principle. The very enormity of the calumnies which they circulated through their agents should have sufficed to excite mistrust. But the Emperor Constantine was no longer the youthful hero who had escaped from the snares of Diocletian's court and the maneuvers of Galerius. So, yes, there was an attempt to kill him. Constantine, he was a young man before he had arisen to power. They tried to do away with him. Diocletian and Galerius, persecutors of the Church, Diocletian was the emperor, and Galerius was one of his Caesars. Again, the empire was becoming so expansive, so extensive, that it was impossible for one man to rule it from one place. And so Galerius was one of Diocletian's Caesars, which you may remember from last year, gave rise to the situation in which Galerius was in a sense the primary persecutor of the Church in the time. Diocletian did put to death some martyrs himself, but it was Galerius who was really the one who was really determined to try to destroy the Church. And Diocletian pretty much just let him have his way for the most part. So Diocletian was not only allowed that to happen, as well as himself enacting carrying out some persecution personally even. But these were two names that come up all the time in the martyrology: Diocletian and Galerius. Also Constantine, our author here, mentioning him as the one who triumphed over Maxentius and Licinius. Yes, the emperor Constantine had to fight wars in order to establish himself as emperor. Very famously, Maxentius was the one whom he defeated at very famously the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, before which he had clearly been told to fight under the sign of the cross, and under which sign, of course, he gained total victory. But this is the same emperor who did all of that as the one who is now dealing, in a way that we can only describe very poorly, with the Arian crisis. So, 100 times he had seen the falsehood of the charges made by Eusebius of Nicaea against St. Athanasius, yet each new insinuation of that courtier prelate found him as credulous as the one that went before it. He accordingly named a commission to meet at Antioch, composed of various Arians, so very disappointing, of course, whom he directed to inquire into the conduct of the Holy Patriarch. He wrote to St. Athanasius, summoning him to appear before this tribunal to clear himself from the charges alleged against him. The Patriarch objected to the commission on the grounds that it was wholly made up of his personal enemies. That's a pretty good objection. Constantine then appointed a council to be held at Caesarea in 331 AD. The city was the choice of the Arian bishops themselves, as they reckoned its prelate Eusebius among their chief abettors. So another problematic Eusebius, this one of Caesarea. St. Athanasius again refused to appear. In other words, recognized this is just going to be a kangaroo court, as they call it. This is going to be a show trial. His guilt was clearly predetermined. When your enemies put you on trial, it's highly unlikely they're going to give you a fair trial. Highly, highly unlikely. The city was the choice of the Arian bishops themselves, as we said. St. Athanasius refused to appear and wrote to the emperor to state his motives, which were perfectly justified by the care of the two bishops Eusebius, that no prelates but those or their own party should be admitted to the council. So, in other words, the fact that it's rigged is as clear as day. This refusal of the Holy Patriarch furnished Eusebius of Nicaea with a, somehow characterized here by our author as plausible pretext, to accuse him to the emperor of obstinacy, disobedience, and open revolt against the laws of the empire. His constant refusal, alleged the heretic, only proved his guilt the more. So this is to call all of this the doings of low characters is insufficient, even if true. The irritated emperor changed the place of meeting and ordered that the council should meet at Tyre in 335 AD, and wrote to St. Athanasius that if he again refused to appear, the imperial guards would seize his person, if necessary, even on the patriarchal throne. So, this is, as dramatic as all of this is, one thing is clear, abundantly clear: it is not the same thing as the current situation in the church. Whatever it is not the same thing. So, we'll continue with this. Yeah, our main, not only, of course, is it edifying, very interesting and edifying to see how saints have dealt with situations such as this, but also we do need to make it abundantly clear that there is no parallel, there is no justification for schism to be found in any of this. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, men subtuum presidium confugimus sancta Dei Genetrix, nostras deprecationes et specias in necessitatibus, sera periculis cunctis libera nos semper, Bilcum et benedicta. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.